In the 1940s, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer introduced the concept of the culture industry as a critique of how modern capitalism repackages culture into standardized, mass-produced products. In their view, mass culture is not a spontaneous creation of the people, but rather a top-down system that shapes tastes, thoughts, and behaviors to serve the status quo. What once may have been art, with its capacity to disturb, provoke, or enlighten, becomes mere entertainment, designed to soothe and distract. Fast forward to today, and the viral spread of absurd short-form videos, like those in the Bombardico Crocodiro Tuntun Saur trend, represents this cultural degeneration in one of its most distilled forms. These videos are not anomalies. They are perfectly designed outputs of a system that rewards spectacle over substance. Their incoherence isn't accidental. It's the point. They flood our screens with randomness that bypasses critical thought and stimulates only the most basic reactions: laughter, surprise, or confusion, all detached from meaning. Adorno believed that in the context of the culture industry, entertainment becomes a tool for conformity, not through force, but through repetition, a quiet hypnotism that makes passivity feel pleasurable. The short video format today is the ultimate realization of this mechanism. It offers stimulation without engagement, distraction without challenge. The endless scroll of absurdity conditions us to consume rather than reflect, to laugh without understanding why, to share without considering what. The user doesn't just watch the trend, they become part of it, replicating its sounds, gestures, and logic. But what logic is that? One of noise for noise's sake. This is not cultural expression. It's cultural sedation. The viewer is no longer a participant in the world, but a receiver of pre-chewed absurdities. And in this process, thought itself becomes a burden, a relic of a slower, less entertaining past. What's particularly dangerous is how these trends disguise domination as play. The idiocy is wrapped in a candy shell of fun: exaggerated faces, nonsensical catchphrases, garish sounds, all engineered for maximum virality. It feels spontaneous, chaotic, even rebellious. But in reality, it's deeply structured and incentivized by algorithms that reward the most easily consumed, most neurologically triggering content. Adorno warned of this false liberation, a condition in which people believe they are choosing freely, while in truth, their options have been pre-selected and manipulated. The user feels joy, not realizing it's the joy of submission, to trends, to templates, to attention economies that commodify every click. The problem is not just that the content is dumb, it's that it encourages a worldview where depth is irrelevant, coherence is boring, and critical distance is a disadvantage. Idiocy becomes a currency, and the market is booming. Perhaps most unsettling is how quickly we adapt to this landscape. The more we consume the bizarre, the less bizarre it feels. What was once absurd becomes familiar, even comforting. This is how the culture industry manufactures idiocy, not by imposing it, but by normalizing it until resistance feels awkward, even elitist. If you question it, you're accused of overthinking, of not getting the joke. But what if the joke is on us? Adorno saw mass entertainment not as harmless fun, but as a mechanism of psychological regression, a way to infantilize the public, to keep them in a state of emotional dependency. The rise of meaningless trends is not separate from this. It is its perfect expression. A society bombarded by noise forgets how to listen. A society addicted to silliness forgets how to think. And eventually, the spectacle doesn't need to silence us, because we've silenced ourselves. In 1967, French philosopher Guy Debord published The Society of the Spectacle, a prophetic critique of modern life under capitalism. For Debord, the spectacle was not just media or entertainment. It was the total domination of life by representations. The world no longer appears as it is, but as it is shown to us. Reality is displaced by its image, and experience is replaced by performance. In today's digital culture, we no longer simply live. We broadcast. Every moment becomes content. Every gesture is curated for an imagined audience. The absurd viral trends we see, like exaggerated dances, gibberish sounds, and characters like Crocodiro Tuntun Saur, are not anomalies, but symptoms of a deeper transformation, where life is consumed through screens and spectacle becomes the default mode of social interaction. These videos don't reflect reality. They replace it. The more ridiculous they are, the more real they seem. Not because they're meaningful, but because they dominate our shared attention. The spectacle thrives on exaggeration. In Debord's analysis, it doesn't just distract, it colonizes. It becomes the lens through which we interpret the world. As these trends spread, the logic of performance seeps into daily life. People no longer just communicate. They act. Not with sincerity, but with a sense of being watched, of needing to entertain. The viral absurdity of these short-form videos isn't limited to the screen. It trains us to value immediacy over insight, chaos over coherence, appearance over depth. A person shouting nonsense into a phone becomes more visible, and, ironically, more real, than someone reflecting in silence. That visibility is power in the age of the spectacle. But it's a hollow power, one that inflates the ego while deflating the soul. The individual becomes a performer in a stage of infinite noise, and anything that doesn't sparkle, like nuance, doubt, or introspection, is edited out of the script. What makes this dangerous is that the spectacle doesn't feel imposed. It feels chosen. No one is forcing anyone to watch these videos. But Debord reminds us, in a society of spectacle, freedom is an illusion. When the logic of the spectacle infiltrates every corner of life, even our choices are shaped by its codes. The algorithm doesn't simply reflect our desires. It manufactures them. And in this feedback loop, absurdity becomes a kind of norm. The user watches because others are watching. The video is shared because it's already popular. What matters is not whether it says something, but whether it circulates. Meaning is irrelevant. Attention is everything. And so, viral idiocy becomes a language, a lingua franca of empty gestures and synthetic emotion. The tragedy is that in this sea of images, the real becomes less visible, less urgent, less desirable. We stop searching for authenticity because simulation is more stimulating, more clickable, more addictive. Debord's ultimate insight was not just that society would be mediated by images, but that we would forget how to distinguish between the image and the real. This is exactly what we see in the viral trends of today. A blurring of lines so complete that the absurd becomes the standard and the meaningful feels alien. When people spend more time watching distorted filters and nonsense phrases than engaging with their own thoughts or relationships, the spectacle has won. It has redefined what it means to exist, to connect, to feel. We don't just watch the performance, we become it. And slowly, the world outside the screen begins to lose its texture. Conversations become rehearsed. Emotions become content. Experience becomes something you document, not something you inhabit. In the world of the spectacle, reality doesn't disappear all at once. It fades, pixel by pixel, until all that's left is a loop of hollow noise that we mistake for life itself. In 1985, Neil Postman published Amusing Ourselves to Death, warning that the greatest threat to a free society wasn't tyranny or censorship. It was entertainment. More specifically, a society so deeply addicted to entertainment that it no longer takes ideas seriously. Postman compared the dystopias of Orwell and Huxley, arguing that we wouldn't be oppressed by force, but seduced into submission by amusement. Looking at today's digital landscape, it's hard not to see his prophecy unfolding. The absurd trends that flood short-form video platforms, where nonsense phrases go viral and attention spans shrink to seconds, are not just harmless fun. They are the living embodiment of Postman's fear. A culture where distraction is more appealing than truth, and where the line between news, thought, and comedy dissolves into noise. In this world, idiocy thrives not because it's forced on us, but because we welcome it with laughter and applause. Postman's central concern was that when public discourse is dominated by entertainment, all serious conversation becomes impossible. And that's precisely the effect of this new wave of viral absurdity. How can you talk about ethics, politics, or meaning when the dominant cultural force is a trend based on a crocodile costume and incoherent sounds? It's not just that people prefer these videos. It's that the very medium trains the mind to reject anything more demanding. When meaning competes with memes, memes win. Not because they're better, but because they're easier. Easier to watch, easier to share, easier to forget. The intellectual life of a society cannot survive on this diet of endless amusement. Postman didn't oppose humor or play. He opposed a cultural order in which nothing but humor and play remained. In such a world, depth becomes a liability, and intelligence is filtered out by algorithms designed to favor the quick, the loud, and the absurd. The scariest part is how seamlessly this shift happens. One doesn't need to consciously choose to avoid reflection. The system does it for you. You open an app intending to check a message, and suddenly you're 10 videos deep into a spiral of absurdity. Tralalilo, tralalala loops in your head, not because it means something, but because it means nothing. And that's what makes it stick. Postman believed that the most powerful form of control wasn't suppression of speech, but saturation of noise. When there's too much to pay attention to, nothing is worth paying attention to. That's what we see now. The constant bombardment of dopamine triggers leaves no room for silence, no space for doubt. And thought, real, sustained thought, requires both. The result is a collective erosion of inner life. We become restless, easily bored, addicted to stimulation. It's not that people can't think. It's that they're never given the conditions to even try. Postman's diagnosis of the problem wasn't technological. It was cultural. The issue isn't the phone in your hand, but the mindset it encourages. One that sees reality as content, truth as optional, and thinking as a waste of time. This is what makes the rise of viral idiocy so alarming. It's not just a matter of taste. It reflects a deeper transformation of how we process the world. The joke isn't just entertainment anymore. It's the dominant cultural currency. And in a society that laughs constantly, the ability to confront pain, complexity, or ambiguity begins to atrophy. Entertainment, once a space of relief, becomes the water we swim in. So all else begins to drown. In the end, Postman feared that we would become a people who had forgotten how to be serious. And if these trends are any sign, we may already be there. Laughing, distracted, entertained, and slowly, collectively, thinking ourselves into irrelevance. Byung-Chul Han, the South Korean-born German philosopher, has spent the last decade diagnosing the psychological ailments of modern digital culture. In books like The Burnout Society and The Transparency Society, he argues that we live not in a disciplinary society of repression, but in a performance society, one driven by constant self-exposure, positivity, and the pursuit of visibility. In this context, the viral absurdity of short-form videos is not just a distraction, it's a symptom. When people film themselves mouthing nonsense phrases, dancing in grotesque ways, or parodying reality in increasingly surreal forms, they're not simply participating in a trend. They're responding to a deep cultural compulsion to be seen at all costs. Visibility, not substance, becomes the measure of worth. The more exaggerated, the better. In this system, depth is an obstacle, something that slows you down. The inner world is irrelevant if it cannot be converted into views, likes, or shares. Han describes a world where everyone becomes their own marketing department, constantly branding, performing, and curating themselves for others. This isn't narcissism in the traditional sense of vanity or self-love, but a kind of digital self-objectification. You turn yourself into content to survive the attention economy. The trends we see today, chaotic, noisy, and absurd, perfectly mirror this dynamic. They are performances that require no interiority, only presence. To pause, to reflect, to withdraw. These are now acts of cultural resistance. The mind becomes restless because silence has no value in a world that rewards only noise. And the more we perform, the more we burn out. Han's fatigue society is one where exhaustion doesn't come from oppression, but from the pressure to always be active, visible, optimized. Even idiocy becomes a form of labor, the labor of being entertaining. In this loop, we lose contact with ourselves. We forget how to just be, without an audience. The tragedy is that what masquerades as liberation is actually another form of control. The internet gives us the illusion of freedom. We can say anything, do anything, share anything. But this radical openness leads not to empowerment, but to fragmentation. Han calls this the terror of the same, a culture where everyone is different in the same way. The viral trends might look chaotic, but they're all built from the same mold: fast, funny, meaningless. Everyone performs the same nonsense over and over, convinced of their uniqueness while reproducing a uniform script. This endless cycle is exhausting, but also addictive. The user is trapped not by force, but by desire. The desire to matter, to belong, to be seen. And in trying to stand out, we paradoxically dissolve into sameness. The self becomes thinner, more anxious, more fragile. Thought requires space, but the algorithm demands immediacy. The result? A culture of constant output with no interiority. Han warns that the erosion of silence, solitude, and slowness is more dangerous than we realize. These aren't just poetic ideals. They are the conditions in which thought is born. The hyperactive absurdity of digital trends doesn't just drown out critical thinking. It prevents it from ever forming. In the race to be louder, we abandon the capacity to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves. And without that inner listening, we become hollow performers in a theater of distraction. The problem isn't that people are dumb. It's that they are exhausted, overstimulated, and disconnected from their own depths. Viral idiocy thrives in this vacuum because it asks nothing of you. No effort, no reflection, no stillness. Just scroll, mimic, repeat. Han's diagnosis is clear. We are not free. We are fatigued. And the more we chase attention, the further we drift from meaning. In a society that rewards the superficial, intelligence is not just neglected. It is quietly exiled. Jean Baudrillard, the French sociologist and philosopher, proposed one of the most unsettling ideas of the postmodern era, that in our media-saturated world, we no longer deal with reality. We interact with simulations. In his work Simulacra and Simulation, he argued that contemporary culture produces copies of things that never had an original. These simulations take on a life of their own, creating what he calls hyperreality, a state where the boundary between the real and the fabricated dissolves entirely. When we look at viral trends like Bombardico Crocodiro Tuntun Saur, what we're witnessing isn't just absurdity. It's simulation taken to the extreme. The gestures, the sounds, the facial expressions, they don't refer to anything real, emotional, or meaningful. They are pure surface. But in a world where the surface becomes the message, these meaningless performances gain an ironic power. They feel more real than reality itself. What's truly disorienting is that people begin to relate to these simulations, not as parody or critique, but as expressions of cultural participation. You don't need to understand why the video exists. You just need to share it, laugh, repeat it. It circulates not because it carries meaning, but because its meaninglessness is contagious. And in this context, Baudrillard's prophecy becomes undeniable. The simulation doesn't just replace reality, it becomes preferable to it. Because the simulation is more vibrant, more exaggerated, more stimulating than the slow, complex, and often disappointing textures of real life. So intelligence, thought, and subtlety are sidelined. They're too slow, too quiet, too ambiguous. The simulation, on the other hand, offers a fast, bright, and emotionally manipulative feedback loop. In that loop, even stupidity is simulated. We don't just witness idiotic content. We participate in the theater of idiocy, rehearsing it daily until it feels natural. The viral trends we see today are no longer content in the traditional sense. They are simulations of content. They simulate humor without being funny, simulate communication without saying anything, simulate identity without authenticity. And people perform them not because they believe in them, but because performing them is the only way to exist in the digital agora. The terrifying brilliance of hyperreality is that it requires no belief, only repetition. It thrives on its own emptiness. A person might know deep down that a video is pointless, but still mimic it because the simulation is what grants social currency. In this environment, intelligence becomes performative too. People don't try to be thoughtful. They try to look thoughtful. Irony becomes a shield against vulnerability. Emotion becomes an aesthetic. And meaning? It's optional. What matters is visibility. And the algorithms don't reward truth, they reward traction. Baudrillard saw hyperreality as the death of the symbolic, the death of the real as something sacred, elusive, and worth pursuing. What remains is the endless loop of images and sounds, detached from any origin, seducing us with their polished absurdity. The digital idiot, once an exception, is now the cultural protagonist. Not because they have something to say, but because they know how to play the game of simulation better than anyone else. They become influencers, content creators, viral stars, icons of a system where intelligence isn't measured by thought, but by reach. And slowly, the culture adapts. Schools, media, even politics begin to mimic the logic of the simulation. Shorter, louder, simpler. The tragedy is not that we don't know what's happening. It's that we do, but we keep clicking anyway. In Baudrillard's terms, we are no longer alienated by the lie. We are seduced by the simulation. The question is no longer what is true, but what spreads. And so, here we are, surrounded by absurdity, addicted to distraction, and laughing as the world quietly dissolves beneath a flood of noise. We began this reflection by asking why idiocy seems to grow stronger every day. And the answer, as uncomfortable as it may be, is that our culture no longer protects thought. It punishes it. In a world shaped by Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry, the bizarre becomes normal, and entertainment becomes a tool of passive domination. With Debord, we saw how the spectacle doesn't just entertain, it replaces reality. Postman showed us that we are not being silenced by force, but by joy. Joy that flattens meaning into performance. Byung-Chul Han revealed how the pressure to be seen turns the soul into a product. And Baudrillard forced us to confront the terrifying possibility that what we consume isn't reality, but it's simulation. Together, their voices create a chorus that warns us. We are not just losing intelligence. We are losing the conditions that make intelligence possible. But this isn't a call for elitism or superiority. It's not about mocking others or pretending we're above the chaos. No. The first step toward resistance is humility. To admit that we too are seduced by the scroll, pulled into the cycle, numbed by repetition. The second step is awareness. To begin seeing the patterns, questioning the trends, breaking the spell. It's not enough to think critically once in a while. In a culture of viral stupidity, thinking critically is an act of rebellion. It requires silence. It requires slowness. It requires the courage to look absurd by refusing to participate in the absurd. This doesn't mean we need to reject joy or humor. But we must learn to recognize when we are being pacified, not entertained. When our laughter becomes a kind of surrender. If we are to reclaim something human in this digital age, something still capable of depth, nuance, and reflection, then we must learn to cultivate spaces where thought can breathe. Places where the mind is not just stimulated, but nourished. That could mean reading more slowly, listening more deeply, or simply resisting the urge to perform every moment of our lives. It will feel strange, even lonely at times, but maybe that's the point. Maybe we need a little solitude to remember that intelligence is not about being louder. It's about being more awake. And maybe, just maybe, the quietest minds will be the ones that survive the noise. Because in the end, the real danger isn't that the world is full of idiots. The real danger is that we might stop seeing the difference.